won't tell you where we live. I won't tell you our real names. But this story really happened. If any of these things sound familiar to you or happen to someone close to you, see a doctor. Don't wait. People die and they don't tell us. That's what happened to my family. You've been so distant these past few days. I hadn't noticed. I have no idea why. I feel fine. A little depressed, but nothing more than that, Claire replied. My wife promised me and the kids that she would try to keep an eye on it. I thought at the time that it was because she was about to turn 40. We had just returned from a trip to Disney World, and she thought it was great. She had a slight fever for a couple days after her return. Her ears were not immediately decompressed after landing, but otherwise everything really did seem normal. I felt like a jerk, rebuking her for being aloof, but it was so out of character. A week went by. She complained that she felt lousy all the time but had no idea why. She was sweating profusely. I made her go to the doctor. The verdict was maxillary sinusitis. She had a lot of mucus in her sinuses, and the excess was deposited in her ear canals. She was given antibiotics and sent home. One night she woke up in a cold sweat, said her fingernails were burning like there was something under them. I'd never heard of such a thing before. She took a couple aspirin pills and tried to go back to sleep. It didn't work. A few days passed and she still couldn't sleep. She became distracted and nervous. She kept flexing and unbending her fingers. They wouldn't stop moving. I searched the internet, trying to see if anyone else had experienced the same problem. Nothing. Then I woke up one night and found her not in bed. She was standing in the kitchen with her hands in the sink. Water was pouring from the faucet, so hot that the kitchen window was fogged up. A box of bath salts stood on the table next to her. "Claire, what are you doing?" "Oh, nothing. Go back to bed, baby. I'll be right there." "What's going on, Claire?" "Nothing, baby. Go back to bed," she said calmly. I came closer. She turned around, hiding the contents of the sink, but I managed to see that the water was pink. Confused, I looked around. There were pliers lying on the kitchen table. "What the hell, Claire? I'm fine. Seriously, look at me. I'm fine. I feel so much better." "I know what it looks like." She removed every single nail on every single finger. "It looks crazy," I screamed. "I know. I watched some videos on how to do it safely." "Are you crazy? What's safe?" I didn't realize what was going on. Just some quiet voice in my head told me the answer. I did everything and took a couple pills. Pain's gone. No fever. I feel great. I insisted she go to the doctor tomorrow. Claire didn't object. I realize now that I should have gone with her to check on her, but I didn't even think about it then. Claire didn't go to the doctor. She would later tell me that something told her not to. She slept like a baby for 2 days, even took a day off work, and except for the bandaged fingers, she was herself again. I insisted she see a therapist. I was worried. And the 3rd day after that night, I found her in the garage. She was staring at the wall, muttering something. It was like she was talking backwards. She was speaking in her native tongue, but the words were strangely garbled. I guess you could call it verbal dyslexia. Fragments of words were coming out of her mouth, jumbled together in random order. That's the only way I can describe it. I walked over to her, patted her on the shoulder, and Claire came to her senses. She looked at me as if nothing had happened. I must be sleepwalking. I must have dreamed I was making small talk with someone. She joked back, got dressed and went to work. 5 hours later, Claire was home. She aggressively threatened to kill a co-worker. She was fired. The only reason the police weren't called was because she agreed to be fired, and she had nothing to say about it. She was as stunned and scared as I was. I have absolutely no recollection of that happening. I barely remember getting home. What's happening to me, honey? I don't know. I need to get something checked out. My first thought is a brain tumor. I made an appointment for my wife the next morning. In the early evening, she spiked a fever again. I asked her sister to pick up the kids for the night, dropped them off at her house and ran to the store. to get some medicine. When I got home, I heard her crying from the street. The walls in the hallway were smashed to rubble. Sobs came from our bedroom at the end of the hallway. I went to my wife's room, noticing with horror that she had punched gaping holes in every wall. Drywall and shreds of insulation were lying in piles on the floor, and everywhere, bloody palm prints. I found Claire in the far corner of the bedroom, naked, curled up on the floor, a sledgehammer lying next to her. Her fingers were bleeding. All the bandages had fallen off. Steve, what the hell is happening to me? She was covered in sweat. Her hands were bleeding. She was on fire. Oh my God, I was terrified. Steve, what's wrong? You have a terrible fever, Claire. There's something in the walls. There's something in there, baby. I can hear it. It won't shut up. It's driving me crazy. You need an ambulance. I need an ambulance, she said. Yes. I ran to the bathroom and filled the tub with ice water. Who knew how long the ambulance would take to get to us? We live more than 30 kilometers from the city. I called 911 on the fly, dumping all the ice from the freezer into the tub. There wasn't much of it, so the frozen food went in there too. Claire's body was so slippery I could barely hold on. She struggled to the bathroom, slipped, and fell right into the water. A bone crunched in her leg, but Claire didn't even react. What she did react to was the water. It's too cold. No, too cold. She tried to get out, started talking gibberish again, begged me to let her go, to help her out of the cold. I explained that she needed it, that she needed to cool down, and then she shook. I didn't know what to do. I held her head above the water and tried to make sure she didn't bump or hurt herself. I could see that her leg was broken, dangling in the tub like a rubber snake. Her head went under the water every now and then. I tried my best to hold her face and not let her drown. And when the ambulance siren wailed outside, the convulsions gradually stopped. Something warm poured out onto my hand, supporting her head. A large, millipede-like insect crawled out of Claire's ear and into my palm. I instinctively jerked my hand away. The millipede flopped into the water. We have to get it out of the tub. Can't let that thing touch her again. That was all I could think about at that moment. I was panicking and I couldn't get her out. All I was able to do was nudge the water with my hand, throwing the insect off to the other side of the tub. The millipede twitched and wriggled, and then went quiet. "What's going on?" she said. "Claire, I'm so tired. Help me." By the time we got to the emergency room, Claire's fever had broken. She was starting to speak normally. Other than a broken leg and arm, she was fine. I fished the insect out of the water with a plastic bag and gave it to the doctor in the emergency room. He immediately slipped it into his coat pocket. He didn't ask a single question. The doctors kept Claire overnight. They gave her a strong sedative. She fell asleep immediately, and I passed out in the chair next to her bed. In the middle of the night, an unfamiliar doctor came into the room. When I could barely get my eyes open, I looked up at him. He put his finger to his lips, then he squatted down next to me and whispered, "I need to check something. Please be quiet, okay?" I nodded. The doctor walked over to my wife and turned her head to the right. He placed some metal instruments, a small bottle of alcohol and a plastic container on the bedside table, and then shined a flashlight into Claire's ear. I watched silently as the metal tool entered my wife's ear. There was a slight popping sound. The doctor took a long pair of tweezers and pulled a small tumor into the light. A moist pouch, about the size of a small grape. The pouch went into a plastic container. The doctor picked it up, a bottle of alcohol, and came over to me. He squatted down, pressed the tumor with his finger. It burst. Hundreds of tiny worms scattered inside the container. They were crawling all over each other. I couldn't take my eyes off it. "Your wife is a very lucky woman. I'm glad you got here in time." The young were about to hatch. Usually the female doesn't leave the nest until the hatchlings arrive. The icy water must have forced her out of her warm spot. The cubs must have devoured her in the first few hours, and then they would have spread inside the hostess. This would finally drive your wife crazy, but not before the worms spread to you, your children, and any pets in the house. The doctor set a plastic cup on the floor and poured some alcohol into it. The little worms convulsed and then slowly stopped moving. He looked at me again. I'll tell you something that can't be made official. There's too much money involved. Have you been to Florida, Alabama, or Mississippi lately? We just got back from Disney World a couple weeks ago. I nodded. I see. Your wife will be fine. Many doctors and pathologists in the East are reporting similar cases, and those who speak out publicly lose their license. Doctors treat patients, but it will never be documented. They will never admit it, and I'm not going to. No one listens to us because they are paid to do so. Those responsible for this scourge are trying to fix it, but they can't. It's only going to get worse. When corporations mess around with genetics and release experiments into the wild, mutations are inevitable, not just in the fruits of the experiment, but in the whole chain that feeds on them. Officially, it's all myth and conspiracy, but mutations are spreading. Stay away from those who behave the way your wife did. He got up and left. Claire's symptoms were blamed on a psychotic episode. I've alerted close family and friends, but I don't think that's enough. So I wrote this post on the net, but I think it will be removed from here soon. I wasn't going to make any sacrifices. It may seem reckless to some, but at that moment I was driven by the noblest of feelings. I wanted justice and revenge. It seems only recently have reports of people disappearing, a large percentage of them children. It was still unknown what kind of creature was hunting them, and I wanted to find out. I was young, ambitious, my enthusiasm was so off the charts, and I decided on a desperate act. I was going to catch the killer myself. At night, leaving the station from duty, I arrived at the forest park, where, according to reports, children were disappearing. Since the main entrance was closed, I climbed over the fence. I had a flashlight and a camera with me just in case something happened to me. At least if the police could find it and view it, my colleagues would know who was behind everything. My contribution would be enormous. I was not afraid to be in the dark forest all alone. I knew this park like the back of my hand. I knew every path, the abandoned cars and strange trees, the one-story maze house and the fuel tanks. I was absolutely confident in myself and my abilities. What kind of police officer am I without proper training? I had some good combat skills and a pistol in my reserve. I knew I could handle it, but I didn't know then what kind of nightmare I would face. I turned on the flashlight. A ray of light illuminated the nearby trees and the wide path that diverged in different directions. I turned decisively to the left. I had my camera in my right hand and the flashlight in my left. The adventure had begun. Dry, fallen leaves crunched beneath my feet, and night bird song was heard all around. Even though my confidence was at an all-time high, I flinched a little at the sudden rustling behind me, even though I knew they were just animals. Soon, as I expected, I came to a lone oak tree in the middle of the trail. When I shined my flashlight on it, I saw a piece of paper somehow attached to its trunk. An ordinary piece of notebook paper, but why was it hanging there, and for what purpose? When I got closer, I saw 2 words written on it: "Help me." I couldn't tell from the handwriting whether it was childish or not, so I didn't really know who had left it. Did the person really think it would help him? Just in case, I tore off the sheet with the scary writing on it and slipped it into my pocket. As soon as I did, the forest was suddenly silent. The chirping of birds, the cawing of animals in the foliage, the chirping of crickets, all went silent. Frankly speaking, the silence made me uneasy. I spun sharply on the spot and shouted a warning. As expected, there was no response. I moved on. A leaf is a leaf, but the case is not waiting. After walking some distance, I came to the Labyrinth house. Well, let's take a look in there. Maybe the killer's lurking in there. I took my gun out of its holster and fearlessly entered the room. The corner changed to a new corner, but no sign or appearance of the serial killer could be found. I looked around warily and moved toward the exit. A flashlight beam illuminated the brick wall of the cabin, with a piece of paper hanging from it. What again? This time the new inscription read, "Don't turn around or he'll grab you." At the bottom right, a little man or a tree was drawn. Judging by the small head, it was a man. But why did he have such long arms? The notes were left by a child after all. That explains a lot. Suddenly, something rustled behind me. I turned around sharply and barely noticed a quickly flashed shadow about 5 meters away from me. 3 shots rang out and everything went quiet. I ran to the spot where I had seen the vague shadow. There was nothing. No corpse, no trace of blood. What was it? Maybe it was just an animal and I'd wasted my bullets. Still looking around, I continued on my way. The silence continued to press on my ears and no rustles were heard. Just behind the hut, the cisterns became visible. I still wondered how they had gotten here and for what purpose they stood. I walked parallel to them and, surprisingly enough, saw another note. Well, the collection of waste paper in my pocket is constantly growing. This time, there was a drawing on the sheet, trees and a man standing in the middle. Like the previous sheet, he had long arms and no face. Quite frightening. I walked around practically the entire park and found a note at every conspicuous spot. I don't know why I wanted them, but I also kept ripping them off where they were attached. On the huge rocks, I found the 7th leaf. Suddenly, I felt someone's presence behind me with my whole body. I turned around sharply. My camera began to hiss, and a strong interference filled the screen. And then I saw him. He was standing not far from me, about 10 meters away. The light of the flashlight illuminated a tall silhouette in a dark suit, which had a terrible thinness and incredibly long limbs. But most frightening of all was his face. Empty, pale, with no sign of eyes, mouth, or nose. My fearlessness immediately evaporated. What the hell is that? Without remembering myself, I ran. Tree branches whipped across my face, leaving scratches, but I didn't care. A terrible fear pierced every cell in my body. I ran without remembering myself. I was saving my life. Never in my life had I been as scared as I was now. This man... No, he's not a man. He's a monster. I didn't believe in any mystical tales of monsters and otherworldly powers until now. But there's no way a person can have no face, is there? I ran without looking back. But after a while, my breath hitched and I had to stop. I turned around hysterically, but saw no one around me. Didn't he run after me? Suddenly, I realized I was lost. There were nothing but trees towering high above my head. There was no path, no landmarks in sight. How could this happen? I walked at random in a straight line. My heart was racing, threatening to burst out of my chest. Cold sweat poured down my throat and covered my eyes, but I ignored it. I wanted to get out of this damn place. The moonlight barely shone through the dark treetops, and the forest was pitch black. Except for the dimly glowing flashlight, I was walking in total darkness. Among the countless trees that surrounded me on all sides, I noticed one that stood out among the others with its blackened bark, and on it hung a leaf. With a sinking heart, I went over and tore off the note. On it, in huge letters, was written a single word: run. My blood froze in my veins and my heart began to race as I realized that he was standing behind me. A loud scream cut through the forest silence. The flashlight and camera fell out of my hands. I turned to run away. He was standing in front of me, and I realized this was the end. The last thing I remember was the sudden dizziness and the savage pain that pierced my entire body, and a face, a cold, blank, scary face. When I was a kid, one summer my parents and I went on vacation to my relatives. They lived in the middle of nowhere, near the forest, and the places there were swampy, impenetrable forests, in general, a gloomy area. We arrived in the afternoon. It was cloudy and raining. While we settled down, adults started to make a barbecue, women fiddled in the kitchen, and my brother and I were bored. Toward evening, we ate meat, sat down as a merry group at the table. The adults drank alcohol. The fog descended. It was often like that there in summer. In between singing songs, relatives told stories about local people. One of them deserves special attention because it is directly related to what happened next. There was an old man who lived in their town. His house was very old, practically in the forest, and the old man was rarely seen, maybe once every 2 years. The old man never talked to anyone, wore the same clothes, and always avoided people. None of the locals knew how old he was. He seemed to be older than everyone else there. The strange thing was that in winter there was never any smoke from his house. He had no relatives, at least nobody saw them. When the old man came out of the forest, he always looked for about a minute in the direction of the city, then turned around and went back into the forest. His house was never lit from inside. Anyway, we are sitting eating, having fun. A fog came down so thick you could touch it with your hands. It stayed there for a couple hours until it started to get dark. Then it started to dissipate. Someone came up with an idea. Since the fog had cleared, we should take a picture of the whole crowd against the background of the forest before it got dark. We got together and took a picture with the then fashionable Polaroid. I remember that on the developed picture, there were a lot of small defects in the form of perfectly round spheres, and they were mostly concentrated around the old man's house. After that, the men went to bed. The women stayed to talk at the table and finish their wine. Well, my brother and I with them. We gossiped, talked about the locals, and remembered about the old man again. My brother and I were looking at photos, and we came across a common picture. Kids are very impressionable. When we saw the old man's house surrounded by balls in the background, we were frightened. And when in the next picture we saw the old man himself in the distance, moving away into the forest with some bag, we felt that it was beyond our strength to look at it ourselves, and I showed the pictures to my mother and sister, and they passed them around. Everyone agreed that it was creepy. What happened next traumatized my psyche for the rest of my life. Late that night, we all went to bed. We went to see our neighbors off. Their house stood between our house and the old man's. We came to the fence and said goodbye, and then we heard a strange, eerie rumble that came from the forest and spread throughout the neighborhood. I began to tremble with fear. Then a new sound, like a loud hissing and growling, was added to the hum. It was coming from the direction of the old man's house. My sister and aunt had gone home to wake the men. My aunt was on the verge of a heart attack. The other neighbors came out to hear the sound. Our men came running from the house. No one said a word. They just stood there listening to the sounds and succumbing to the seemingly gratuitous panic. My mother took my brother and me by the hands. Eventually, we all made our way toward the house in the woods. When we were near the house, we smelled a foul odor. The smell of metal mixed with the smell of, old, you know. Somehow it was like the stench of decomposition. We approached the house. It was unclear whether there was someone inside or not. Everyone was very reluctant to knock on the door. Not only was the old man scary, but it was night and those sounds. The door was not closed. The first neighbor came in, followed by everyone else. The house was in a terrible shambles. It stank like hell. They went into the living room or the dining room and were stunned by what they saw. There was an old woman lying on the floor. On her head, something like a muzzle. The old woman herself had no legs and no arms, probably long ago amputated. She was making these horrible noises as we realized that her chest had been punctured. Nearby on the floor was a sharp iron stake. That's what they used to pierce the heart of pigs when they're slaughtered. The women came to their senses and began to help the grandmother. The sight was disgusting. Blood was flowing from the pierced chest, with sniffing sounds mixed with wheezing and growling. My father turned us against the wall so we wouldn't have to look. The neighbor ran home to call for help. About 40 minutes later, the emergency services arrived, the police with them. By that time, the rumbling had stopped. The police later came to the conclusion that the old woman had been locked up for about 40 years and that the old man had slowly cut her up. First thing he did was cut her vocal cords so she couldn't scream. Hell knows how he stopped her bleeding and how the old woman survived. She ended up dying in the hospital, and the old man has never been seen since that day. All that remains is his silhouette in a photograph in the evening, in the distance, against the background of the forest.